Well, we have arrived at the end of our questions series, and to this point, we've studied 8. They've calmed our fears, strengthened our faith, challenged our hearts, realigned our priorities, and even opened our eyes. But today, this last question is so good because Jesus uses it to restore one of his own. This is the question that restores.
I'm thankful we get to end the question series this morning looking at something that is incredibly Jesus. He always gets the last word. He always leaves us with redemption and restoration. Where sin did abound, Romans says, grace did much more abound. And we see that this morning. I want to invite you to open to John chapter 21. You'll also want to mark your Bibles or your devices in Matthew chapter 26. We're going to be in both of those sections this morning. Most all of our time will be in John chapter 21, but we will be in Matthew chapter 26 as well. I've enjoyed this series. I hate to see it come to an end. This is our 9th question out of over 100 that Jesus asked in the Gospels. I hope you have enjoyed reading the Bible on your own and going through the Gospels and considering the questions that Jesus has asked his disciples and why they still matter today. This is the one that restores. And let me tell you kind of what is taking place at this moment before we read our text. Jesus has already been betrayed. He has been crucified. He has resurrected, and now this moment that we're going to read about is the third time in the Gospels that Jesus has presented himself to the disciples. So this is the third time he's revealed himself as the conqueror of the grave. So Jesus is in his resurrected body at this moment. And what takes place, John chapter 21, last chapter in John, Peter has said that he's going to go fishing. That's what's taking place in chapter 21. Peter says, I'm going to go fishing. And 6 of the other disciples said, we want to go with you. So Peter and these other 6 form 7 in the boat of the Sea of Galilee. And while they're fishing, they're not catching anything. And the Bible tells us in chapter 21 that Jesus comes to them and says, have you caught anything? And they say no. And Jesus, like he did in the beginning, gives them instruction on how to fish and where to fish. And they do follow his instruction and they catch a net full of fish. They realize that it is Jesus on the bank. So Peter dives out of the boat, comes swimming to Jesus, and Jesus invites them all over for breakfast on the beach. And after he has had breakfast with the disciples, with the 7 that are there are still others that were not there. But among that group of 7, Jesus feeds them, and then he starts asking some questions. And I want you to look at the question in our focus this morning. It's verse 15. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, feed my lambs. And he said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said, yes, Lord, you do know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. And he said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. I said that this is incredibly Jesus this morning because every bit of it reveals something we've already seen about Jesus through the questions. Everything this morning that we're going to see in this dialogue between Peter and Jesus highlights something most all of us have already known about Jesus. And here, if you notice something, that these 7 disciples out on the Sea of Galilee were all under the watchful eye of Jesus. Even though they didn't realize he knew where they were, even though they didn't realize that he knew what they were doing, he did. And he came to them. And this is why it is so incredibly like Jesus that he comes to his children. He initiates it. He finds them. He invites them. He feeds them. And I just want to tell you this morning that if you have ever struggled with feeling like you've messed up too much for Jesus to ever use you, this message is for you. If you feel like you've done things that you never should have done and God does not love you anymore, this message is for you. If you are living your life sidelined in your relationship with God because of your disappointment in yourself or in somebody else, this message is for you. Because this is the question that we end our series with, the one that restored. Well, there are many things about this question, or these 3 questions that Jesus asked Peter that we don't know. Because truthfully, none of us were there, and the description of this, the account that John gives us, seems to imply that there were things that happened that you had to be there for. That you needed to be able to be there at the scene to know exactly what Jesus was talking about. So some of this is going to be a little bit of speculation to kind of get a full understanding to the best of our ability of what Jesus is really trying to get across. But number one, I want you to see the setting of this question. I want us to consider this because it's unique. Because there are 7 total disciples there. They had gone back to fishing. Jesus calls them away from fishing, performs the miracle of this miraculous catch of fish. They come to the bank. They eat. Let me just say one quick thing about eating. Notice that these hard questions that Jesus is asking Peter only comes after he had shared a meal with them. There's something to be said about the power and the fellowship and the intimacy of a meal together. Jesus here feeds them. No doubt there is conversation among all 8 around that fire with the smell of food. There's something incredibly strong and bonding about the relationship of people eating together, because it's only after eating that Jesus turns to Peter and says, we got to talk. The setting of the question is interesting because he targets Peter. Now, if we just were to read chapter 21, we wouldn't really have any context for why did Jesus target Peter? Why did Jesus ask him these 3 questions? And he doesn't say. Jesus doesn't say to Peter, Peter, I'm asking you this because. John doesn't tell us. John doesn't give us any contextual clues about why Jesus is asking Peter in the presence of all the other 6 disciples this painful question 3 times. So we're left to assume. I think there's a fair assumption that we can make on our part. Because Jesus asked him 3 times, when Jesus says something once, it's important. When he says something twice, it's incredibly important. When he says something 3 times, it is crucial. And here, Jesus says the same question 3 times to Peter. It's an important question that Peter has to answer, and does. I want you to see a few clues as to why we can assume Jesus is targeting Peter with this question 3 times. And that's where Matthew chapter 26 takes place. In the last moments of Jesus' life before his betrayal and his beating and his crucifixion, he takes in chapter 26 of Matthew, takes his disciples into a large upper room. There he quells their argument over who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven by showing them who is the greatest. He washes their feet, offers up his high priestly prayer, eats the Passover, and institutes the Lord's Supper. All of these things are taking place during this very intimate moment in this upper room discourse. And Matthew chapter 26 is something that is recorded in all four of the Gospels. But I want to take Matthew's account starting in verse 30. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. They've now left this upper room. He's going out into the Mount of Olives. This is where Jesus is to be betrayed in just a few moments by Judas. This is to be where we're going to see a lot of failures on Peter's part. This is going to be where Jesus is praying and sweating drops of blood. Jesus said to his disciples as they leave the upper room, "You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you into Galilee." But Peter answered him, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same. That's Peter's declaration. But now look at Peter's denial. Chapter 26, verse 69. Jesus has been betrayed. He's being hauled off to the multiple trials through the night. And this aside in verse 69 says, Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." And he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you mean." And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, saying, "I do not know the man." And after a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, literally saying, "God, strike me if I'm lying. I call heaven to record my words." That's the strength of what Peter is saying right here. I call heaven and earth to record my words, and God may strike me dead if I'm lying. I do not know the man. And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the sayings of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. The setting of the question seems to imply that what Jesus is doing is coming to him. And the instance of the 3 repetitive questions is because Peter denied him 3 times. It is as though Jesus is taking Peter back to that moment in an attempt to restore him. Number 2, I want you to see the content of the question. If this is true, and Jesus is taking Peter back to that moment of his denial, I want us to consider the very important content. What does this question try to do? What is this question intending to do? What is the purpose of Jesus asking this question? The only way we can answer that is to really look at what the question is. Think about this. Number 1, Jesus is asking him a question that is real. And what I mean by real is Jesus is asking him one that is both seeking and simple. It is one that is going to search Peter's heart. None of us like being questioned about our love. None of us. We all want to believe that our love is amazing and incredible. We don't want to be questioned about our love to God. We don't want to be questioned about our love for other people. We don't want to be questioned about our love for country, because love is something that is so incredibly personal and powerful and in some ways private. When you question somebody's love, you are questioning something that lies at the very heart of who they are, but yet that's what Jesus does. Jesus doesn't say, "Peter, do you have faith?" Jesus doesn't come to Peter and say, "Peter, do you have good theology?" Jesus comes to Peter and drives at something that is at the heart of the relationship that we all have with God. It is love. "Peter, do you love me?" Jesus was asking him a very simple, straightforward, searching question. Something that Jesus reveals is important. It's important for all of us. It's a fair question for every one of us to ask ourselves this morning. Do I love Jesus. Simplest question we could ever be asked. Do I love? Jesus wasn't asking him a facts-based question necessarily, but one that he would have clearly known the answer to. It was a revealing question. It wasn't just a real question. It was a revealing question. What do I mean by that? Jesus says, do you love me more than these? Now, we weren't there, and John doesn't tell us what the these are. There's several options of what the these are. It would have to be there's something there present that Jesus is comparing Peter's love to. He's saying, Peter, do you love me as much as you love these? Now, the different items that we know were there were the fish and the boats. It's possible that Jesus could have been pointing to the fish, this net full of fish for these commercial fishermen. He could have been pointing to the boats. Could have been pointing to his comrades who fish with him in the boats. He could have been pointing to them and saying, in light of this, do you love fishing more than me? Or in a sense, do you love your old life more than you love me? Do you love what you were doing before me more than you love me? And I think that's a fair question for us to ask. God, are there things in my life or practices in my life that I love more than you? Now, I don't know if that's what Jesus was suggesting or was trying to imply, but it's a possibility. He could have held up one of those stinky, smelly fish and said, Peter, do you love me more than these? How serious would that have been? Of course, yes, Lord, you know that I love you more than those. Maybe he was pointing to the rest of the disciples. Remember, this is public. Maybe Jesus is turning to Peter and saying, Peter, do you love me more than these other 6 that are here? I don't know. I'll tell you what I think. I think that's the one. I think Jesus was turning to Peter and saying this, Peter, do you love me more than these other 6 do? Jesus was showing Peter that there was an issue. It was a real question. It was a revealing question. It was a question that took Peter back in a place to remind him of his failure. None of us want that. Painful. It says Peter was hurt. Number 4, it was a repeated question. Jesus wouldn't let him off the hook. 1 question did not suffice. 2 would not do it. It had to be done 3 times. There's a reason, I believe, Jesus was saying, Peter, do you love me more than these other 6? Because if you remember back in chapter 26, when Jesus said, the scriptures say, the smite the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered, all of you, he says, are going to run from me tonight. All of you are going to be offended of me tonight. Do you remember what Peter's question, what his answer was? Oh, Lord, everybody else may run, but not this guy. That's what Peter was saying. Peter, you may have pegged those other 11 or the other 10 at the time. You may get them right, but you don't understand, Jesus. I'll die for you. You got them right. They're probably going to run, but not me. Let me tell you, the denial that Peter does, a 3-time denial that he does, denial in triplicate that night, is part of an overall horrible night for Peter. In the large upper room, Peter is a part of a discussion, an argument about who's going to be the greatest in heaven. And Jesus showing them who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, who the greatest one in the room was by washing their feet. Do you remember Peter recoiled? He didn't want Jesus washing his feet. And then when it comes time for them to go out into the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus, in the moment of this greatest trial, where he's going to be sweating drops of blood, pressed between the will of God and love of man on that wine press, that olive press, being pressed, he calls Peter, James, and John to go a little further in the garden with him and to pray. And when Jesus goes back and checks on them, they're asleep. And then when the betrayer comes, what does Peter do? He grabs a sword and cuts off Malchus's ear to defend Jesus. Listen, this was one event and an overall pretty bad night for Peter. Do you love me more than these, Peter? Do you love me more than these? You know what Peter says? There's a bit of a linguistic dance taking place right here. And in our English Bibles, we don't understand the beauty of it because it just says love. But in the Greek, there are different words for love that mean different things. And two different words for love are being used in this dialogue between Jesus and Peter. And let me tell you, it's amazing. The two words that we find in this dialogue is first agape. Agape love is best represented as God's absolute, complete, full, committed love for us. Agape love is best described as God in His relationship to us in showing this complete and perfect, full love. The other word that's used for love in here is phileo. You know Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. That word comes from the Greek word phileo, meaning a brotherly love. It's more like a friend love. Still very committed. And as agape love is used to describe God's love for man, phileo love is to describe a committed love between man and another person. If you want to think about it, think of agape love as 100% love and phileo being 60%, if we could put it like that. Here's this little dance that's taking place. Now, don't get me wrong. There are other little dances that are taking place. There are other uses of words back and forth between them. But for the sake of our time this morning, I want to focus on the word love. Here's what happens. Jesus comes to Peter and says, Peter, do you love me? Agape. Peter, do you love me 100%? And you know what Peter's answer is? I love you, phileo. I love you 60%. Now, initially, we're stunned. We would almost think that that's offensive. That Peter would have the audacity to turn to Jesus and say, well, I don't love you as much as you love me. But let me tell you something. To me, that reveals that Peter got it, that he understood. Guys, that is enormous. You know what the old Peter would have said? When Jesus said, do you love me, agape? Peter would have said, I'm offended that you asked me that. I'm appalled that you would ask me if I love you like that. Look at all these others. Did anybody else go jumping out of the boat to swim over here to the shore? No. Did any of these other disciples take time to count all 153 fish in that net? No. Of course I love you. That's what the old Peter would have done, but not this Peter. Not the broken Peter. Not the humble Peter. Look at his answer. Jesus says, Peter, do you love me, agape? Peter says, Lord, listen, I don't know what everybody else loves. I don't know the level of love that these other 6 around here have, but God, all I can tell you is how much I love you. That's it. Jesus asked him, do you love me more than these? If it is the people, Peter won't fall into that. The old Peter would have. Yes, Lord, you know I love you more than them. Why are you even asking me? That's the old Peter, the new Peter, the broken, the humble Peter, the one that is so well aware that not long ago he denied even knowing Jesus. Says, oh, I tell you, I love you 60%. To which Jesus says, feed my lambs. He affirms his answer and gives him a commission. And the second time, Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? Agape. And Peter says, I love you, phileo. Doesn't change his answer. But then the third time, Jesus says, do you love me, Peter? But this time, in the original language, Jesus doesn't say agape. He says, phileo. To which Peter says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I phileo love you. What an incredible action on Jesus' part. He doesn't continue to beat Peter over the head with a love that Peter has confessed I can't keep. He doesn't force Peter into confessing something that Peter has already said. That's not me. Jesus says, all right, Peter, I'm going to ask you this. Let's get it on the record. Do you love me, phileo? Peter says, oh, you know everything, God. I believe Peter was so struck by the pain of his denial that he could no longer compare himself to anybody else. He was now no longer going to say, I love you more than. No, I can't. I just know what I have right here. Look at the outcome. Peter's answer revealed that he had been humbled. The questions repeatedly back and forth, it even says that he was hurt. I think in that moment of being hurt, Peter, do you love me? Being asked that 3 times, I believe that hurt was healthy. Because without question, it would have reminded Peter of the hurt Jesus would have had in hearing one of his own say, I call heaven and earth to record that I do not know the man. Every time Peter answered, Jesus gave him a commission. You may say this morning, it was painful. Jesus should never have asked all of this. Jesus never should have taken Peter down that very difficult road full of spiritual potholes in front of everybody. But let me say this, and this is where we come into play. Jesus knew the role that Peter was going to play in the kingdom coming forward. He knew not long from here, on the day of Pentecost, Peter was going to stand up and give the first sermon. He knew that Peter, who started out Simon, was going to be the rock. And Jesus was doing this for several reasons, because Jesus knew who he was and what he was going to do. And Jesus was asking those questions then to prepare him for that moment. And what happens? We mess up, we fail. We deny Christ. Our faith is not strong at times. We slip into temptation, whatever it is, and we feel like, man, I've really messed up. God can't use me. Listen, God knows his plans for you. And even though it may be painful to go back and revisit those areas of our failure, God wants us to learn from those and to reinstate us into the purpose that he has. God does not want any of us sidelined. He wants us all to be in the game, motivated by love. It was essential that those other 6 who knew Peter had failed needed to hear Peter say that. They needed to hear Peter say, I can't compare my love to you. All I know is I want you to know I'm sorry. They needed to see that Peter was a changed man. They needed to see that Jesus had not given up on them. They needed to see that God had affirmed his plan in Peter's life. And let me tell you something, Peter needed to know it too. Peter needed to know that God didn't give up on him. Peter needed to hear, feed my sheep, tend to my lambs, feed my lambs. He needed to know God still had a plan for him. Listen, he calls him Simon. The name he had before Jesus changed his name to Peter. We see the picture of the fish and the boat and the fishing going back all the way to the beginning when Jesus first called him. And then among the last of the words Jesus gives him is, follow me, the very first words Peter heard. You see, what Jesus is doing is setting up this scenario where it takes Peter back to the very beginning. Jesus is tying it all together. Peter, I got you. I got you. Come on, Peter. Don't give up. Don't sit there anymore. Don't be weeping bitterly in tears. Now allow the rejoicing to come. from forgiveness and reconciliation. There's a prophecy about Jesus in Isaiah chapter 42. It's repeated in the Gospels. And in chapter 42, it says this. Isaiah chapter 42 says, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoking wick he will not quench. Those words were spoken specifically of the Messiah. What do we see Jesus doing with Peter? He's bruised. He doesn't break him. He mends him. He doesn't snuff that flame out. He fans it. Jesus doesn't want to break you. Jesus doesn't want to snuff that flame out. He wants to fan it. He wants to mend you. Today, do you love me? That's the question. Are we asking that to ourselves? Are we allowing the Holy Spirit to ask that question of us? And in light of that question, what is our answer? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. If we love him, it's going to show itself through how we serve and minister to others, how we follow him. I'm going to invite you to come if you've got a decision to make public. Maybe it is rededication of your life. Maybe you've sat on the sidelines for a long time, disappointed in yourself, disappointed in God, disappointed in somebody else. Where sin abounded, grace abounded much more. Today, whether it's rededication, salvation, membership, whatever it is, I pray that we would not leave here without making Jesus Christ first and foremost in our life.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to our podcast at First Baptist Joplin. If you are interested in coming and worshiping with us live, we would love for you to come at 9 and 10:30 on Sunday mornings.